Welcome to USC Facebook Live. I'm Juan de Lara, and I'm the director of the Latinx and Latin American Studies Center, where, as I like to say, every day is Latina and Chicano Heritage Month. I am also an associate professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC Dornsife College. And for those of you who don't know, American Studies and Ethnicity is part of a longer struggle for the right to establish ethnic studies departments within the academy. And this longer struggle also brought us things like Latinx Heritage Month that we are celebrating today. And as we gather to celebrate these great scholars that I have with me today, I would like us to remember all of the communities, organizers, students, and faculty who have fought for our right to host conversations like these at one of the top universities in the country. Today, I'm joined by three USC colleagues who will introduce themselves in just a moment. And all of us are here today to discuss how Los Angeles can help us to better understand the past, the present, and the futures of Latina and Latino Southern California and beyond. These incredible scholars will help us think about the Latinx future by understanding the past and the present. Our starting point is three recent books which take place in three different LA neighborhoods. These three books, in their different ways, are changing and challenging how we think about Los Angeles and Latina and Latino Los Angeles more specifically. George Sanchez's book on Boyle Heights, Natalia Molina's book on Echo Park, and Pierrette Handagno-Sotelo's book on South Central LA will all reshape the ways that we think about Latinx historiography. Today, we will discuss how these books can help us think about democracy, community, and political power. And with that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to Natalia Molina to introduce herself and to tell us a little bit more about her new book. Natalia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalia Molina. I'm a distinguished professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity. My work examines the interconnectedness of racial and ethnic communities through my concept of racial scripts. But I have a new book forthcoming with UC Press, which is entitled Placemaking at the Nayarit: How a Mexican Restaurant in Los Angeles Nourished Its Community. And it's trying to get at how, in a world that sought to reduce Mexican immigrants to invisible labor, the Nayarit was a place where people could become visible once again, where they could speak out, claim space, and belong. And now I'll turn it over to George Sanchez to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History and the director of the Center for Democracy and Diversity here at USC. I'm also a scholar of Chicano history and immigration to Los Angeles. My recent book is Boyle Heights: How a Los Angeles Neighborhood Became the Future of American Democracy. In that book, what I try to do is take Boyle Heights through its whole history when it was a multiracial place in the early part of the 20th century in the principal Jewish community of Los Angeles, and where that interaction between Mexicans who were here from the very beginning, Japanese, Jews, African Americans, Armenians, Italians, all the different groups that made up Boyle Heights, how that shaped Latino history in the east side of Los Angeles, and then how over time different groups left Boyle Heights, and you had a reconfiguration of the Latino community in Boyle Heights, including the increase of a large number of undocumented immigrants reshaping the possibilities of the way the community would move forward. I'm going to pass the baton on to Pierrette Handagno-Sotelo to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pierrette Handagno-Sotelo. I'm the Florence Everline Professor of Sociology here at USC. And because the book is still kind of recent, I'm going to hold it up. It's my little baby, but it's not just mine. I want to emphasize it's co-authored with Manuel Pastor, and we've also co-authored it with the graduate students and research assistants who helped us understand this process of neighborhood change in South LA, also sometimes called South Central. So we look at neighborhood change over the last 40 or 50 years as a historically important African-American neighborhood has now become majority Latino. What does that mean? How did that happen? And we really try to understand what that means at the neighborhood, daily, the level of daily life. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. So I have, a few questions. I just really want us to have a conversation, and I'm keen to know what people would like to ask each other. Each of you would like to ask each other about writing these books. But let me start this conversation now by asking this question of Pierrette. In South Central Dreams, you and your co-author are loved and beloved dear colleague Manuel Pastor follow this transformation that you talked about, in terms of South LA becoming a predominantly Latino neighborhood. And you look at the changing relationships between Black and Latino groups. And as you wrote recently in a piece in the LA Times, you said that this hasn't always been, kumbaya. It hasn't always been, a seamless process, but that you have found emerging Black-Brown solidarities that are taking place in the middle of this change. And I'm wondering, if you can speak about that, if you can speak about how these solidarities are also influencing what we think about Latinx identity and experience in LA. And this essentially also ties into some of the work that George and Natalia have written about in terms of relational formations of race, right? The way that Latinaness has been shaped by these interactions with other communities, not necessarily white normative ideas, but in the case of Boyle Heights, Jewish, Japanese American communities, and in the case of the work that Natalia has written about various exchanges between Latinos and other racial groups. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to that and what some of those lessons might be.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, we look at change over time, and we look at change over the generations. And so this doesn't just drop from the sky, but we suggest there's a new kind of Latinidad in South LA that has emerged together with shared struggles, shared daily life with African Americans. It didn't just pop from the sky. The first generation of Mexican and Central American immigrants came here in those big boom years, the 80s and the 90s. This was after and during a time when South LA was going through job loss, deindustrialization, violence, street violence, the crack cocaine crisis. A lot of Black families that could left for the exurbs. They went further west. And at that time, so many Mexican and Central American immigrant families came because this was an affordable place to live. There was proximity to jobs, but they didn't necessarily find an easy reception, right? There was racial resentment, violence, unsafe streets, and language barriers, right? This first generation is largely monolingual, and we're not able to establish really close relations with their Black neighbors, although we did find incidences of Black parental mentorship and other kinds of helping. But in general, a lot of social distance between African Americans and this first generation. The story for the second generation of Latinos coming up in Watts, in historic South Central Avenue, is totally different. They have, well, first of all, they're fully bilingual. They have Black friends, girlfriends, boyfriends. They're on sports teams together. They're listening to the same music. They grow up feeling this deep affinity. They have Black teachers, mentors. They see models for civil rights struggles and community organizers, and they feel proud to be part of it. They feel proud to be coming up in a place like Watts that has such an important legacy. So why is this important? I'll just finish quickly so we can make room for more voices. Well, I think it's important for two reasons. One,
Oh, it looks like Pierrette is frozen there. Why don't we use this as an opportunity to jump off, and maybe George and Natalia, you can sort of pick up on some of that conversation that Pierrette, talked about, especially, I mean, the way that George, you write about this, and Natalia, you've certainly written about this, but I was struck by what Pierrette said about the changing nature of Latinidad, right? And what that means to start in a place like South Central. What does that look like in your respective work?
Well, so many things resonate with Boyle Heights, but with an earlier migration of the intense migration that came from the Mexican Revolution in the teens and the 20s. And what you had was similar patterns. You had the parental generation, the first generation, often didn't discuss with the other people in Boyle Heights because they didn't speak the same language. And they were separate, although there were institutions. The institutional connections are really key. In the era I'm talking about for Boyle Heights, it was labor unions and the particular connection between Jews and Mexicans in labor unions. And Boyle Heights became the centerpiece of labor unions. For the second generation, much more interaction. And then the importance of Roosevelt High School and the interactions in the schooling system really create incredible connections with Jews, Mexicans, Japanese. That didn't mean that Boyle Heights didn't go through very difficult periods. The periods that I talk about of Mexican repatriation followed by Japanese American internment during World War II. But people are watching this happen to their neighbors, to their classmates. And they end up with a civil rights tradition that emerges in Boyle Heights, I think best exemplified by Edward Roybal and the Community Services Organization that sort of emerge up from that World War II generation, that generation that's grown up together in Boyle Heights, and really feel like there needs to be change and protection of the community. That's incredibly important. So I sort of see some of the similar things happening in South LA right now because of that generation that's growing up with African Americans and the shared history that's embedded there.
This is so exciting. I have the privilege of teaching a Mexican American history course right now at USC. And at the beginning of the course, I told them that we would talk about things like citizenship, not just in the legal sense, but in the cultural sense, social membership. And we would look at it at the level of the nation, how it's structured by things like immigration acts, but also at the local level, neighborhoods. And so it's fascinating to me to be now talking to two of my esteemed colleagues, interviewed by another esteemed colleague, about how that change, what it means to be Latino is so different, not just between Los Angeles and New York, Los Angeles and Miami or Texas, but even within Los Angeles, just some zip codes. And so much has to do with who's around you. When we talk about race being a relational concept, it's also about who your neighbors are and how the space that you live in has been structured. And so when George mentions in Boyle Heights, that kind of diversity that we think about like diversity, it's good, is also made possible by things like racial covenants, federal government redlining, the construction of freeways. And so it's a very different experience to feel like you're in a diverse area, but because you have something in common in terms of being outsiders. And so what I try to talk about in my book, Place at the Nayarit, is looking at a semi-public space, a restaurant, which is clearly a private space in terms of its own, but in so many ways, it gave its Mexican customers a freedom that public spaces like parks and pools and beaches did not necessarily, because they were segregated. Yes, even in Los Angeles, they were segregated. And so it was a place that people could go to after work and speak in Spanish, make the sign of the cross before they ate a meal, sing along with a trio, really take up space in a place where otherwise they might just have been thought about as laborers. So it's also trying to get at what that identity of being Latino means when you are, you have that kind of freedom. But Echo Park, like the places that George and Pierrette talk about, is a multi-ethnic, multiracial area because it doesn't have the same kind of racial covenants that other neighborhoods do. And there is a progressive attitude that's historical in terms of, longshoremen working there, union workers, artists. So we also need to look at that longevity of what kind of those progressive politics and that effect that it has for years to come.
Thank you both so much, and I'm hoping that Pierrette can rejoin us. But I want to sort of jump off there and maybe talk a little bit about how you position these three books, your work, in the context of Latina Chicano history and scholarship and how we understand LA. If you look at the earlier writings, we went through this period of trying to understand the barrio as an isolated, separate space. And I think both of you have done some work to sort of complicate that, as well as other colleagues in other places. And I'm thinking here of UCLA. But I'm wondering, given the way that each of you have talked about complicating what it means to be Latina or Latinidad, I'm wondering if these kinds of methodological interventions and approaches to studying LA, what do they do to our understanding of how we understand and how we study Latinidad moving forward in a place that is so complicated and complex like Southern California? Can we totally understand what that means? Or are we sort of looking at multiple versions of and articulations of what it means to be Latina and Latino if we're looking at such a complex landscape like Southern California?
Well, I'll start. I would argue that all these books reflect a newfound, I want to say, strength of understanding Los Angeles as a Latino city.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that we are the majority. And there's no fear of that. There's no unabashed. I mean, we present ourselves as Los Angeles history and culture. Not as a minoritized population inside of a larger city. That is a critical new perspective. And even when I'm talking about the past in Boyle Heights, I'm looking at people that had networks with other folks, that had connections in other parts of the city, that made their way around the city in different ways, that tried to figure out, how do I protect my neighborhood while at the same time still enjoy being someone in Los Angeles and take pride in that. And I think that's a very different kind of work than older work that was always trying to understand the kind of minority population that was isolated in a given neighborhood. None of our populations are isolated. We're all actually talking about people who make connections with other people as they make their way through the city, welcome other people to their neighborhoods, and what that creates into a very different Latino experience. And I think this is one of those places in which the present is affecting the way we're writing our history. It's not about a minoritized population. It's actually about a full member population of the city that we know.
Yeah, I think, I completely agree with George. I also, a different strand of that is, when we talk about LA being a Latino city and with that majority, we're also saying, if you take an ethnic studies class, we always talk about race as a social construction, right? What does that actually mean? That means that we're talking about the ways in which people's racial identities or racialized experience is shaped through, hi Manuel, is shaped through cultural means, through structural means, like immigration laws, like zoning laws, that kind of thing. So to understand the ways in which LA became a Latino city is also to understand the ways in which LA became a racialized city. And so the kinds of lessons that we learn by the Latino experience has also happened to the 80 ethnic and racial groups in Los Angeles as well. And so it's a way that groups can also find common cause. When we look at a figure like Edward Roybal in George's book, which we were doing on Tuesday in my class, my students right away picked up, wait a minute, we knew he was the first Latino elected, but it wasn't just Latinos that elected him. No, it was a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition because people understood that they had a stake in each other's futures. And so to me, the message of these three books is a message of hope. It's not a kumbaya kind of hope, as you mentioned earlier, Juan. It's a message of hope in saying we have differences and we may have different racial and ethnic experiences, but we do understand that there are commonalities in terms of access to healthcare, access to education, how we experience the pandemic. And you know, this is a very important moment to have this message of hope and common cause as we see the inequalities that the pandemic has just completely brought to the forefront, as we go to elect a new mayor, as we just went through a recall, and we need to understand the importance of these kind of cross-coalition politics.
Speaking of, that's a great segue into our new guest, Manuel Pastor, who is the co-author of the book with Pierrette Handagno-Sotelo, who is having technical difficulties. So Manuel was following along and so kindly joined us. So I want to give you space now to talk about that or talk about other things you want to talk about. But that point, the book that you co-wrote with Pierrette speaks about a neighborhood that has been profoundly transformed by the growth of social movement, progressive social movement politics. That is where organizations like Community Coalition, like Scope Agenda come out of. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the role that those organizations have played in crafting these kinds of coalitions. Because somebody asked in the comments about Latinos and how people are using the political power, and given the fact that as we are now, and as George said, not a minority, but actually an overwhelming large population in Southern California.
Great. Well, I'm the emergency backup plan for South Central Dreams. So hopefully Pierrette gets reconnected. And I missed the first few minutes. I forgot, didn't quite get what you said, but one thing I would say that has been really important is not the supplantation of racial identity, but the merging of it with spatial identity. Mm-hmm. So that how you feel like you're a resident of South Los Angeles, that you feel like you've been part of a population that's been left behind and kept behind, and yet part of a population that is incredibly resilient at an individual level. There's many great stories of people making it from South LA, but resilient at a social level in terms of being able to deal with change and emerge with a new kind of organizing. And that's been one of the secrets of South Los Angeles. It is not to say that there's never been Latinos in South LA. There always have been. There was just a big, big growth in the 80s going into the 90s. And it's also not to say that there hasn't been Black-brown organizing in Los Angeles in the past, including in South Los Angeles. But what was distinct in the past was that it was often, for example, the concerned citizens of South LA, mostly Black, based in South LA, organizing with the mothers of East LA around environmental issues, largely Latina, based in Boyle Heights, actually. And so there were two geographies fighting coalition. It's different to find coalitions in the same space. And that's what's been crafted in South LA is this kind of frontier of Black-brown organizing that is trying to find a common ground around shared space issues, and is also trying to make a link toward more progressive movements that can really change political power. One of the things to realize is that this is not easy work. And it's also really important, and we raised this in the book, it's asymmetric work. What do I mean by that? If you are Black and an organizer or even a community member in South Los Angeles, you need to be thinking about what your relationship is to Latinos, particularly if you're a Black political figure. Mark Ridley Thomas, for example, got elected, yes, with Black votes, but very much with labor and Latino votes. If you're a Latino political figure in East LA, you don't have to think very much on a daily basis about what your relationship is to Black people, Black organizers, etc. If you're Latino in South LA, you constantly need to think about your relationship to the Black political establishment, organizing efforts, etc. And the reason why this is important is because Latinos in South LA have developed the skill of building coalitions on a face-to-face, neighbor-to-neighbor basis, as have Black people in South LA. And that is an important skill that we need citywide. We need to make sure that people who are in the San Fernando Valley, who might not see many people of color, although how can you be in LA and not see many people of color? Or people who might be in an area that's all Latino, that they recognize the need to form these citywide coalitions. And I think that, by the way, has been the secret of George's work over the years, is to show how much multiracial organizing in Los Angeles owes to an Edward Roybal and the kind of work that happened in Boyle Heights and more generally in East LA. And in some ways, George's famous work, the making of Mexican Americans, rooted in place. We're talking about the making of a new kind of Latino, rooted in place, rooted in South LA.
Thank you so much. So we have, unfortunately, only a few minutes left. But I do want to ask if anybody has any questions of each other. One thing that I would plant here is, in the conversation, in the national conversation about race, I think Latinas and Latinos still get left out most of the time at a national level. So I'm wondering what your work, what LA can teach us about, localize, centering the experience of racial formation and Latinas and Latinos in LA, and how can that contribute to a national conversation about race? Or you can have, any final comments that you would like to make. We have roughly about 4 minutes. George or Natalia?
I'll start. I think it's critically important to refashion the conversation around democracy at a local level. The interactions we've been talking about are absolutely critical. So is the diversity within the Latino population. The fact that in my work, the undocumented are such a critical part of the Boyle Heights community. They have to be incorporated into the way we envision communities and into the politics that happens at the local level. It's not about voting. It's about incorporating them in neighborhood protection, in ideas of progress. They're such a vital part of that. So for me, it's localized democracy that's going to be the way that Los Angeles will move forward.
As someone who also has a specialty in public health, I was called upon to do several interviews during the pandemic about, about the ways in which our ideas about race that were directed once to Mexicans, to Latinos, how that how issues of disease and public health stigmatized them in the early 20th century, and what we might learn about that for the pandemic in terms of anti-Asian racism. And there was a lot of sympathy when we look back at those Latinos from 100 years ago. But when it came to giving undocumented emergency care, vaccines, COVID relief, time off for having vaccines, all those kinds of things, a lot of times that disappeared. And so I wrote an op-ed saying, we can't be essential if we're illegal. And so another thing we must come to terms with is who's doing our labor, who's taking care of our children, who's at those meat packing plants, who is doing our childcare, just in every single way for years and years. We can't look back and think, oh, they did it wrong then, without looking at what we're doing now.
Thank
I
you.
just want to add how much Paret and I feel we owe to both George and Natalia. George pioneered what it was, at least for me, to do a kind of place-based analysis that says that identity is not fixed or essential, but it's actually really rooted in place. And Natalia, you know this already, but we were in the middle of going through all this data, trying to figure out how to tell the story, completely confused. And then we read Relational Racial Formations, slapped our forehead and said, that's the analytical frame that we've been looking for. So we owe so much to these two colleagues for their work. And I would be remiss if I didn't also add that we should actually have a special session about Juan's book, Inland Shift, because it also is talking about how place, the inland, Valley or Inland Empire forms a very different kind of identity and terrain for political struggle, and maybe, in my view, one of the most brilliant books of the last decade in both sort of geographic studies and Latino studies. So worship.
Too kind, too kind. This is about your books, not mine, but thank you very much. Pierrette has joined us. I don't know if you want to say anything before we have to leave. We are at the 4:30 mark. Pierrette, if there's anything you wanna say.
Gosh, I'm sorry that my internet cut out and I'm not able, I think I have to be accepted for the video here, but just kind of adding to what Manuel said, I think I also want to mention our intellectual indebtedness to Wendy Chang and the whole notion of racial ethnic sedimentation, a notion that really gets at that pushes back at the traditional sociology way of looking at ethnic secession, thinking of things as a reconquista, one group taking over another, and no, relational racialization, racial ethnic sedimentation speak to the processes we see happening in South LA.
Well, I know Wendy Chang. I'm sure she will be happy to hear that from you, Pierrette. She respects your work tremendously.
Brett, I tried to fill in when you dropped off.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any final comments from our panelists? I do want to say we have at USC tremendous Latino scholars working on issues that transcend a lot of different disciplines. And this has, again, part of this struggle to create these kinds of spaces within the university. And so I'm really, really honored that we've actually crafted a tremendous opportunity for us to bring these kinds of scholars to USC. And we're very lucky to have you all here. So any final comments before we go? Natalia.
No, I was just looking for the heart emoji.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. We're out of time here, but I want to thank all of our guests. I want to thank the audience for joining us on USC Facebook Live. And please read these books. Go out and buy them right now. Buy them from an independent bookshop if you can. And we look forward to more of these kinds of conversations. Thank you, everyone.